all across America and around the world. This is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Welcome to Veterans Radio. I am Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today. We've got some great programs for you. I think you'll find very interesting. We always want to remind you, you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or by going to veteransradio.net, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.net. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We also want to thank Eisenhower Center. It's a brain injury recovery center. Learn more about eisenhowercenter.com. They're located in Michigan and in Florida. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. Contact us if you'd like to be a sponsor on Veterans Radio, and let's move on to our program. First up, we're going to hear from a Vietnam-era doctor. He is now retired, living down in Florida, but he had a chance to reflect with us what it was like to be a kind of a brand new doctor sent to Vietnam, and some of his experiences that were both chilling and life-shaping. So I think you'll enjoy the conversation with Dr. Sam Kalush. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today Dr. Samuel Kalush. Dr. Kalush spent a little time in the Army back in the day. You graduated from U of M, University of Michigan Medical School in 1966. And then Uncle Sam came calling, and you served in Vietnam as a battalion surgeon and then from August 1967 to April 1968, I should say, that's when you served. And then you served as a staff surgeon in the 98th EVAC Hospital in Da Nang from May of 1968 to July of 1968. Dr. Kalush then returned to the United States, was at Fort Bragg to finish out his tour at Womack Army Hospital through 1969. Went on to train in general surgery, followed by heart surgery. Was in private practice in heart surgery in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Saginaw, Michigan, until the early 90s. Got smart, moved south to nicer weather in Sarasota, Florida, and continued on helping out as a cardiologist until 2020. So you've had a long and distinguished career in medicine. I want to bring you all the way back, Dr. Kalush, to when you had those captain bars on. You ready for that?
I'm ready, shoot.
So why don't you tell us how a nice doctor like you got pulled in to be a battalion surgeon?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction there, which was very nice, thank you very much, I got a draft notice in the spring of 1967, as most of my classmates did that were in this intern class in Milwaukee. And I was ordered to report to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio for boot camp for doctors. That was a 1-month boot camp. And that went by pretty quickly, and they gave us a few bucks and some uniforms and put us on a plane, a commercial flight, over to Vietnam. And I landed in Vietnam and basically jumped on a helicopter, and they took me out to my assigned unit, the 1st to the 28th, with the 1st Infantry Division. And I was a captain, and I was the medical officer for the battalion with a squad of medics. And from there, we carried out our various missions.
And back, let's remind folks, because we have so many people who are listening to Veteran Radio here, Dr. Kalush, that it was common, and in fact, I don't know if any doctor didn't go through this process. They may not have ended up in Vietnam, but Uncle Sam was grabbing doctors left and right, wasn't he?
Yes, in 1967, as I remember, every one of my peers in my internship class, in my medical school class, had an obligation with the federal government, most of which was being drafted into the military service in one branch or another.
Correct.
Yes, and it was all new experiences. I've heard that in a war, you have to relearn the lessons that people learned in the previous war, and that was certainly true. I had never been exposed to the trauma that I was about to see in Vietnam, nor the civilian illnesses that we saw over in the subtropical region. So it was a learning experience as well as service.
So talk to us a little bit about, Sam, about what the role of the battalion surgeon was at that point in time.
Well, I had the immediate responsibility of looking after the health needs of the battalion, along with my squad of medics. Generally speaking, we had the squad of medics, which were to support the morale of the enlisted men, and you had the doctor in the units to support the morale of the officers. But beyond that, we had a sick call every day because with several hundred people in the battalion, we had the usual and variety of illnesses that come up in any large group of people. And, of course, we had the wounds from war that we had to take care of and provide a lot of first aid. We had to concentrate on evacuation of personnel that were seriously ill or seriously wounded. That was part of our duty. And if we had civilians or enemy troops, we provided care for them as well. We really didn't distinguish too much in terms of how we took care of people if they brought us a patient. So a lot of this was sophisticated first aid, but sometimes we actually had to do some fairly aggressive surgical procedures in the field if it was a life-saving situation.
Well, that's part of how medicine has really changed over time, is what you actually could do in the field or shouldn't do in the field. But let me back you up. How many doctors would have been in what's the size of the medical team?
Well, we had, for this battalion of about anywhere from 400 to 600 soldiers, we had the one doctor, myself, and I had 7 or 8 medics with me.
Americans also came up with a lot of unusual diseases, tropical diseases that you just don't see in.
Well, that's very true. One of the most common illnesses we saw was malaria. We picked up a lot of malaria over in Vietnam. Part of that was due to the fact that the enemy troops, particularly the North Vietnamese that came into the country to do their fighting, they brought the malaria with them, and they infected the mosquitoes, who then would come over and infect our troops. So we had to learn to recognize malaria. And if we recognize it, then we evacuated that individual, because that's not something I could really take care of in the field.
This wasn't the sort of assignment or detail that kept you safely behind the wire, as they like to say today, or in the green zone.
Well, we spent so much time in the field on our sweeps, on our so-called search and destroy missions, and there was really no safe space once we were out in the jungle. We would conduct our sweeps, and of course always fearful of snipers or an ambush. And then we would construct what we called a night defensive position. It was really an overnight camp. And we'd put up a security circle of troops who stood guard. But when we did come under attack, there was really no safe space to go to. Everybody was vulnerable. They put us in the middle of things and brought the wounded to us in the middle of our encampment. And we just kind of hoped we could get some treatment going, clear a spot for the helicopter to come in, and depend on the soldiers to prevent the enemy from overrunning the camp.
You're a brand new doctor. You're a brand new, captain. This is not an experience you've ever had. What was the first firefight like for you?
Well, the first firefight, we were actually camped out at an airstrip, and we had conducted a sweep in the area a little bit northwest of Saigon. So it was kind of a remote airfield. We got first wind that there could be trouble when there were journalists and photographers that showed up. And they generally only showed up if there was a pretty good chance that we were going to encounter the enemy. And that night, the enemy attacked us. We came under heavy fire from artillery and small arms fire. And really, the enemy came right up to the wire, and we were able to hold them off, and we were able to survive the night and win the night. But we lost some of our soldiers that night, and we retrieved several of the enemy dead as well. And the unique thing about that for me, I'll never forget, they brought me a soldier who had been hit with shrapnel in the mouth and jaw, and he was really having trouble breathing because it was his teeth and his tongue and everything was lacerated with this artillery fragment, and he just couldn't get air in and out of his lungs. And I had to go ahead and do an operation. It's called a tracheotomy. It's making a little slit in the front portion of the neck and putting an airway tube directly in to the trachea and bypassing the area of the injury. And things were quite intense at that time, and I remember that the only light I had was a flashlight, and the commander of the unit said, "Doc, use the red filter on it because we don't want any bright light here to give away our position to the enemy." So with the medics helping me and a red light, I was able to get this airway tube in, and we were able to evacuate this kid. And I always wondered just what happened to him, but I never got a follow-up. And that was our first encounter with the enemy.
Well, and we're talking to Dr. Samuel Kalush, who was an Army captain, surgeon in Vietnam. We're talking that period of 1967, 68 primarily. Doc, as you mentioned, it must have been a sort of a soul-shaking experience to see the carnage among these young kids.
Well, a lot of feelings, a lot of different feelings were going through our minds at that time over this experience. This was something that none of us in the unit had experienced until we got to Vietnam. And I really wasn't that much older than some of these fellows. I was 25 years old at the time. These troopers were 18, 19, 20 years old, and the officers were a bit older than I was. It was trauma that none of us had ever really seen before. It was the anxiety of not knowing how long this encounter was going to last. It was not knowing how many enemy troops were out there, and we knew we had to take care of each other. So you pretty much react according to the training you've had in that kind of situation, and you somehow get through it. I can remember when they flew me in the first day in the field, and I was replacing another battalion surgeon who happened to go to school at Ohio State. Believe it or not, he was a Buckeye.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, and I hopped off the helicopter and I asked him if he would stick around for a day or two to orient me, because I said I really don't know anything about this kind of duty or this kind of medicine. I mean, I'm just coming out of an internship. And he looked at me as he put his foot up on the helicopter. He said, "Listen, the medics will teach you everything you know. I'm out of here." So
we talked about that first firefight, and when we were communicating earlier, you said, hey, I was in a lot of firefights. And I said, well, I'm going to ask you about the most ferocious firefight. Which one sticks out in your mind even all these decades later where you thought, oh, boy, this thing might go the wrong way?
Well, I think the one where I had the most anxiety is was a lieutenant colonel. He came to me and he said, Doc, our sister unit is getting pounded over here a few kilometers away, and their doctor got killed. Can you go over there with some medics and provide the care that they need? I wasn't excited about that, but of course, you just, like I said, you just react. You get on the helicopter and you go over there, and they had a terrible firefight going on, but they were able to get us into it. And they brought me their commander, who was mortally wounded. And that's not good when the unit loses its commander. It's the lieutenant colonel. I tried to save him, but he died on the battlefield. And we fought off these Vietnamese, these North Vietnamese, and the battle ended. And it was kind of late at night at that point. It was 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And I thought, oh, my God, I've got to march back through the jungle at night with my medics. I said, we're never going to make it. Well, a miracle happened in that they brought a helicopter for me and my medics. And I was a little reluctant to get on it because everybody else had to march home. But they said, no, you came from a different unit, and we appreciate that you came here with your medics. And we have one ride out, and we want you to take it. So that was where I think I had more anxiety during that particular encounter than anything else because I was so fearful of having to march in the jungle at night.
Right. What month would that have been? Do you remember, Doc?
That was in December of 67.
In that first firefight, what month would that have been?
That was in early November of 67.
So in the 1 month time, you go from your first to your most ferocious.
Yeah.
It really got to be aging you as you're going through this process, isn't it?
I felt the gray hairs coming in. I'll tell you that. It was you always had the anxiety anyway. Every day there was the anxiety that there were these isolated snipers out there taking pot shots at us. But these battles were another thing. You just never saw the enemy. All you saw was people getting hit and the artillery coming in, the mortars coming in. So it definitely had a level of excitement that I had never really been used to.
I kind of knew who to take out, commanders, to demoralize the troops and try to break the back of that particular unit or platoon, didn't they?
They did. They looked for targets like that. So the officers in the unit did not wear their officers' bars, and we didn't wear any Red Cross or medical insignia on our uniforms or helmets, just for that reason. That if you wore anything to identify you as an officer or as a medical personnel, you would become a special target.
But you had another event in February of 1968 that's noteworthy enough that the Army made notice of it, and you were awarded the Silver Star, which is highly unusual. Tell us about that particular engagement.
Well, we went out in a full battalion sweep, and that was just after the Tut offensive broke loose all over the country. So we knew everywhere, and we knew they were on a military mission. So we got our unit together, the battalion together, the colonel and all the officers, myself, the medics, and we went on this sweep in a fairly populated area. Actually, it wasn't so much the jungle. It was pretty close to Saigon. And I remember crossing a creek, and as soon as we crossed the creek, we heard a few pot shots, and some of the lead elements in our unit got hit, and we thought it was either a sniper or an ambush. Well, it turned out to be an ambush. But before we knew that, as soon as a soldier gets hit, we hear the cry, medic, medic, a very loud cry, medic, medic. So I got up with several of the medics, and we literally ran forward. Well, this was the sign for the ambush to occur, and as soon as we turned a corner, the full force of the North Vietnamese regiment hit us. And I really don't know how I quite survived that, because there were people going down all around me, and there were shells coming in behind us. But somehow we got through that, and then the battle lasted several hours, and we were tending to the wounded as best we could. But we finally won the day, in large part thanks to the air power that we had. Thank goodness we had the Air Force and the Army gunships to help us out. So we turned the tide of the battle, and at the end of the battle, the commanding general came down with his staff. I remember he landed with 2 or 3 helicopters, and he passed out several awards to the soldiers who had participated in that particular ambush, that firefight. And I was asked to receive the Silver Star on the battlefield at that time.
You make this sound like it was just another day at the office, and you and I both know, Sam, it was not.
Yeah. It was a very eventful day that I'll never forget. In fact, one of the things that happened is the general came down and made the awards, and this was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, still plenty of daylight. And then the general left, and the colonel came to us and said, "I got some bad news." He said, "We're missing some of our men." He said, "And we never leave anybody behind, dead or alive." He said, "We're going back in there to get these boys." And I thought, oh boy, I don't want to go back in there. I said, that's just nothing but enemy troops back there. But you just react, and you just do what the colonel asked you to do. And we went back in, and we retrieved our dead and wounded. And we didn't encounter a firefight. We were able to do that uneventfully. But the level of anxiety just never seemed to change, and it was more intense at those moments. But then the next day, we were worried we'd have to face the same thing all over again.
On that eventful day in February 20th of 1968, did your medical team lose anybody in that fight?
We did not. I was fortunate we didn't lose any of our medics at that time.
And again, it's one of those things where I suspect you're going, just like going back to get the fallen troops and surviving that, not having a firefighter, you sort of thank God for small favors, don't you?
Boy, you bet. We had a chaplain with us, a priest who was from Boston. And we all had religion over there, I can tell you that. And attendance at the Sunday services, Sunday Mass was very high. And we got a lot of counseling from the chaplain. He was a really good priest, really good with the troops. But we were all prepared for the ultimate sacrifice. That didn't seem to be a problem. Nobody shirked from any of that kind of duty.
I think people think chaplains and medics and doctors are safely behind the line and aren't faced by these problems. But my guess is that particular chaplain, if he was good, which you say he was, at counseling and working with folks, he got his boots dirty, just like you had to get your boots dirty.
Yeah, he was in the field with us. In fact, he was with us all the time. The medical people were with the unit. It was a guerrilla type of warfare, so there were really no front lines. So wherever the colonel took us, we were all together.
You've been married for 53 years. You've got 3 children. You got 6 grandchildren. Are there lessons you learned, Dr. Kalush, during this service period that you sort of try to pass along or apply in your subsequent medical practice and years of kind of giving back?
Well, I can tell you one thing that Vietnam did. It made me a better surgeon. There's no question about that. I had significant experience taking care of trauma in the field, doing the surgery that was necessary. And then at the end of my tour, I did surgery at the evac hospital. And then the following year, I was very busy at Fort Bragg doing surgery as well. And this military surgical experience, no question in my mind, just gave me better skills to practice ultimately my open heart surgery career. So there was that direct and concrete and physical experience over there that helped me with my profession, my chosen profession. The other thing over there is, when we're out in the field for 9 months, there's nothing to do except fight and be ready to fight. I mean, you can't really pick up and go out to dinner anywhere. You can't go out and see a movie. You can't take a vacation into some area. So you learn to live in the present. I think, boy, nowadays that gets harder to do because you're always planning on something in the future you want to do. But over there, you had to learn to live in the present. And I think that was a valuable episode in my life. I think everybody should have to go through that. After we got over there a while, we started counting the days until we could depart for the home and get back home. It was called the DROS date, the date of estimated return from overseas duty, or something like that. And we really learned to appreciate home, which was our country, the United States. We just couldn't wait to get home and just hoped to get home in one piece and alive. That was it was a deep yearning that never left our thoughts. And, in a war, you have that unique opportunity to see what I would call the best of human nature and the worst of human nature. You see the entire spectrum. And, I don't think there's any other experience outside of war where you can see that degree of complexity in the human nature. Some other things over there, we were all drafted. And when you have a group of people that are drafted, you learn to appreciate the differences that everybody brings to the unit. We had people from all walks of life. We had people of all different colors, all different cultures, but they were all Americans. And these were maybe people you wouldn't see or do much with back in civilian life, but in the Army, being a group of draftees, which we all were, we learned to appreciate each other and learn from each other. Those were invaluable lessons that we learned over there.
Well, I think one of the things, I guess, as we come to the conclusion here, and we're talking to former Army Captain Sam Kalush, Dr. Kalush spent a career as a heart surgeon after his service in Vietnam. Doc, I don't know if people still ask you this, but I always kind of want to get a view of somebody who's been in the military and now away for a long time, and a lot has happened. What's your sense today about military service, if somebody would ask you?
Well, that's a good question. My own perspective on that is I thought at the time that the draft was a very valuable tool that the government had to bring citizens of various backgrounds together.
Dr. Kalush, I really appreciate the extra time that you've provided to Veterans Radio today to give some insight what it was like to be a battalion surgeon in Vietnam.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad to have the privilege of talking to you today, Jim. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this look back by a retired surgeon who was a captain in Vietnam. Every soldier has a story, and we've now heard Dr. Samuel Kalush's. After a short break, we're going to hear from the NOAA Corps. You're asking yourself, what's the NOAA Corps? You want to listen to the next part of the program to understand this uniformed service that provides a valuable service to the United States government and to our country.
Military veterans touch everyone's life. I'm guessing right now you're thinking of a veteran, a close friend, relative. Maybe it's you. Even the toughest of us sometimes need help, but don't know where to turn for support. You don't need special training to help a veteran in your life. We can all help someone going through a difficult time. Learn how you can be there for veterans. Visit veteranscrisisline.net. veteranscrisisline.net. A message from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs.
If you have a VA claim denied by the Board of Veterans' Appeals, contact Legal Help for Veterans at 1-800-693-4800. They're experts in handling cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. Their number again, 1-800-693-4800.
We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today Lieutenant Dustin Picard of the NOAA Corps. This is the first time I think Veterans Radio has ever had the chance to interview somebody from the NOAA Corps. So Dustin, Lieutenant, we're glad to have you.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank you for inviting the NOAA Corps. I'm honored to be here and to talk to you and to your listeners. And I want to thank our veterans, too. You guys have paved the road for us, and I wouldn't be here in this seat if it wasn't for all of our veterans. So thank you to you, sir, and thank you to our veterans listening.
Well, I want to tell a few folks, we have a lot of Army guys listening, and they're going, Lieutenant, what the hell does that mean? Well, sure. The Corps has the same rank as the Navy.
That is correct. Yep. So we have the same ranks as pretty much all the seagoing services, as the Navy and the Coast Guard.
So a lieutenant is a railroad track officer for those Army guys who understand that that's a captain in my language, or the Air Force guys. So we just kind of wanted to set up Lieutenant Picard a little bit about, because people aren't familiar with the NOAA Corps. So why don't you start by telling us what the NOAA Corps is all about?
Yeah, great question to start us off, and it's a very loaded question, so I'll do my best to steer us straight here. So the NOAA Corps is a uniformed service. We are one of 8 services now in the country. So you have your 6 armed services, and most people know the 5, the 6 being the new Space Force, and then you have 2 uniformed services, one being the U.S. Public Health Service, and then, of course, the NOAA Commission Corps being the 8th service there. We're extremely small. We are currently about 335 officers strong, no enlisted corps, but we have a mandate to grow up to 500 now, and I'm sure we'll talk to that here shortly. But we kind of are at the intersection of science and service. So unlike the other services, our missions are completely environmentally and science-based, and that's where all of our funding comes from. In fact, we fall under NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and that falls under the Department of Commerce. So unlike our other services, we are not a part of DOD, we're actually part of DOC. And so all of our missions and all of our funding comes from there. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. I mentioned we are environmentally and science, at the intersection of environmental and science and service. So we do have 2 distinct career paths in the Corps, the maritime side of the house as well as the aviation side of the house. So I'd say it's about a 70-30 split. 70% of us are mariners and maritime based in ship driving, small boat, diving, those kind of disciplines, where the other 30% are aviators, so pilots or navigators flying our aircraft.
And I think some folks would remember the public health service as a uniform service because they see, in this time of COVID, they've seen the Surgeon General who heads up the United States Public Health Service on TV a lot. One doesn't see the head of the NOAA Corps on TV. It's an admiral position, as I understand it.
That is correct.
And but the NOAA Corps has a long history. It's not something new just because you just heard about it. Tell us a little bit about the history of the NOAA Corps.
Yeah, it's a really rich history, so I'll try to be pretty brief succinct with it. We can actually trace our lineage back to the early 1800s, 1807, in fact. And we started off as the Coast Survey. And at the time, we were mandated to survey the coastlines and all the navigable waters of what was then the United States, or much smaller than it is now, but the coastline that we had. And we worked hand in hand with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy to get our job done. Fast forward to the Civil War, and I should say the Coast Survey, we were civilian federal employees. We were not recognized as a uniformed service at this time. Fast forward to the Civil War, we were kind of thrust right into it, just like a lot of individuals were during that time. And we mostly served on the Union side of things as mappers, cartographers, and in all theaters of the war as well. So we kind of started to really make a name for ourselves and assimilate into the services at that point, wearing uniforms with the other Union service members as well. Fast forward to after the Civil War and what we call the pre-World War I years, we started to get more and more funding, and as the U.S. was growing, and so was our territories, we started to get more missions, remote. So we were deployed out to Alaska, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, just kind of making a name for ourselves and charting and mapping these new areas that were coming online. In World War II, a service was created, and we kind of transformed into the Coast and Geodetic Survey. And we were simulated into all the services. So from the Navy, the Marine Corps, our officers served in one or more of these branches, I should say, during the time of the war. We served as artillery officers, mine laying officers, troop transport navigators, intelligence officers. We pretty much brought our skill set to these services and served wherever they needed us. Following World War I, we reverted back to our role, kind of peaceful surveyors, chart makers of the nation, focusing more on navigable waterways and commerce and that kind of stuff. And we spent a year practicing and refining this skill set. Our missions kind of started to increase a little bit to land surveying, and started taking a look more at our airways charting and coastal mapping, as well as oceanography. So we started to expand some of our disciplines and not so much just on bathymetric surveys and nautical charting, but kind of growing into the mold that we are now. During World War II, just like World War I, many of our individuals were assimilated into the other service as well, over half of our forces, in fact. And we were deployed all over in all theaters of the war. Again, we served as hydrographers, amphibious engineers, beach masters, and recon surveyors. We also introduced and started to bring along aeronautical charting, and provide a plethora of technical positions through the services as well. In fact, the USS Pathfinder, which was at the time a coast and geodetic ship, was taken over by the Navy. And Admiral Chester Nimitz is quoted as saying, "The road to Tokyo was paved with Pathfinder charts." And this was not uncommon for our ships to be taken over by the other services. They would often sail ahead of the warships, basically, to chart and survey and provide recon back to the fleet as they advanced. After World War II, we started to return to normal routines, and all was pretty normal for about 30 years. And then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, environmental focus kind of took over the nation, and there was quite a bit of reorganization of government agencies, especially on the science side of things. And that's where NOAA, what we presently know as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was created. And shortly thereafter, the NOAA Corps came into existence as well. And so basically from then on, that's from the early 1970s to where we see today, that's what we know as the NOAA Corps. And yeah, that's pretty much our history.
Well, it's 50 years now that the NOAA Corps has been called that, but as you say, it has this rich history of being the country's chart makers and mappers. And this was all before satellite, all before GPS. Every time somebody went into a new territory, hey, take Guam, take the Philippines, somebody had to go figure out the waterways and where it was safe and where it wasn't to take ships and at what depth. So it's a very fascinating history. And again, because it's so small, it's easy to overlook it. So I wanted to start there for our veteran radio listeners. And we're talking to Lieutenant Dustin Picard, who's with NOAA Corps. Dustin, tell us a little bit about today's NOAA Corps in terms of the equipment that it has at its disposal. You mentioned it's sort of 70% sea service, 30% air service. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, great question. So on the maritime side of the house, we currently have 15 ships in operation. And some of them, the classes are all different. Some of them were built in the 1950s, are rather old, and some of them are brand spanking new. We've got some ships that have sailed in the Navy and came over to our hands. So some of our listeners might be familiar with the Tiegos class vessels. We've got 3 or 4 of those in our fleet currently. And we've got 2 new builds coming online. They're both being built down in Louisiana right now, and anticipated those to be online in 2024 and 2025. So we'll be shortly growing back up to 17 ships for our fleet. And these ships are home ported all over the country. We've got 1 out in Hawaii, a couple in Alaska, the West Coast in Oregon, California, Gulf of Mexico. We've got 3 out of Mississippi in Pascagoula. And then out east on the Atlantic seaboard, we've got ships in Charleston, Norfolk, Newport, Rhode Island, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire as well. So we're strategically located throughout as far as our maritime side of the house is concerned. For our aircraft, we have 9 aircraft currently. We have P3s, Twin Otters, and Gulfstreams. And all these aircraft do a variety of missions, which I'm happy to talk about. Yeah, that's some of our fleet, both on the maritime and the aviation side of things.
Well, in last year's National Defense Act of 2020 that the President signed, there were a lot of dollars and authorizations that were directed to the NOAA Corps, which is allowing you to move the number of officers up to 500, which is a big step up from where we were at about 335.
Absolutely.
How will those additional officers, and as you pointed out earlier, the NOAA Corps is just officers, there's no enlisted. How will those officers be integrated in over kind of what period of time? And what's the Corps thinking about in this big surge of personnel?
Yeah, great question. I think we're still trying to answer that question ourselves, to be completely honest with you. But it's let me start by saying it's never been a better time to be part of the Corps, just for the recognition of the work that we do from Congress, and that is never more evident by the fact that they passed the NOAA Corps reauthorization bill, which you referred to in December, and it decided to increase our number. So before December of last year, we were congressionally mandated to 321 officers. And as you mentioned, this new bill that came through bumped our numbers up to 500. So it's going to be a slow roll. It's not going to be 200 additional officers within a year. That's just not possible or feasible. But we're going to slowly increase our recruitment classes. On average, it's about 10 or so per class, so that might be bumped up to 15 or so. So we'll be increasing our numbers there. And then we're going to look to inter-service transfers, which we already heavily rely on, especially on the aviation side of things. So inter-service transfers from the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, especially pilots and navigators. That is a nice pipeline that we have that comes in, especially at the 03, 04, the lieutenant commander ranks. And so we expect that to continue, but also probably increasing on the maritime side as well. Because as you can imagine, we don't want to increase all 200 officers at the ensign level. We need to increase our numbers across the ranks and not just be a bottom-heavy approach. As far as what we're going to do with all these new personnel coming in, well, I think that's still to be determined. As I mentioned before, we've got kind of 2 sides of our house, the maritime and the aviation side. But there's a lot of talk about growing our unmanned systems program, and I think we're going to see a focus and a surge in officers and recruiting in that kind of realm and that discipline and that background, because let's face it, we all know it, that is the future of not only DoD, but also of our missions too. These unmanned systems can go places a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and a lot easier and safer than we can on our current platform. So currently standing up the unmanned systems program within the NOAA Corps, and I expect to see that be supported by the reauth bill. Additionally, we have talked about using this increase in officers to help strengthen our administrative capabilities as well. Currently, we rely on civilian federal employees, basically NOAA full-time federal employees, to support our missions from a land-based side of things, from an administrative side of things. So whether that be HR or logistics or operations, we have civilians that we work with consistently and continually, and they do a fantastic job. But we're looking at potentially creating some billets for officers. So there might be a career track for that rather than, being operational on the aviation side of the house or maritime side of the house. And additionally, on the same vein is looking at officers who bring like a political expertise to the game. It's very important for us to work with our partners, our congressional partners, for visibility, viability, for funding, that kind of stuff. And so bringing in officers who have a good political background, they might be able to kind of help us in that realm and help leverage and promote the NOAA Corps to continue to further increase our missions, increase our funding. So I think you're going to see that. I think to answer your question twofold, it's going to take a little while to kind of grow these numbers, and we're going to do it slowly because we also need to grow our shoreside support as well. And then also I think you're going to look at different career tracks that'll be available for officers rather than just maritime and aviation.
Well, Lieutenant, you're currently in a recruiting billet, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because historically NOAA's had basic officer training classes maybe every year, maybe every other year, depending on staffing needs. And it recruits out of colleges and universities because they're all officers, and there's this heavy reliance on science and technology. So what's the recruiting pitch? If you're somebody or know somebody in that college realm getting out after a year or two, why should they consider the NOAA Corps?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I'll say this job recruits for itself just because of the nature of what we do. As I mentioned, we're at the intersection of science and service. So we heavily recruit out of STEM programs across the country. And we specifically target, strong marine science programs, strong atmospheric science programs, aviation programs, folks who, and then of course the maritime schools as well, like Mass Maritime, Maine Maritime, Kings Point, Texas A&M, Galveston. These programs are and Cal Maritime as well. These programs are great feeder programs for us because, these students come in with an inclination to serve as it is already, or they come with an inclination in science, and then they hear about the Corps, and it's the opportunity for them to kind of blend both of those interests and do something for their career that they can, answer the calling to serve, but also do something for the environment, for their planet, for the nation, and for the world as well. So I think for those reasons, it's a very attractive career opportunity, not to mention the fact that it's full of adventure. I mean, you get to move every 2 or 3 years, just like any other service, but the nature of our assignments, our deployments are bring you to some really cool places, geographically speaking, opportunity for travel, opportunity to mingle and interact with some of the cutting edge scientists in marine biology, oceanography, atmospheric sciences, whatever it may be. You'll be working hand in hand with these scientists to kind of facilitate their operations and their missions, and that's extremely exciting. And I can't not mention the fact that our benefits program is equivalent to what you would see in the other services as well. So of course the 20-year retirement with pensions available, Medicare, healthcare, all that's medical and healthcare. That's the same across the board. Access to bases and medical treatment or military treatment facilities. Of course, the Veterans Affairs benefits as well, and a GI Bill. All that's available to our officers as well. So for someone who's inclined to serve, but maybe has more of a science background, or maybe has a science background but is looking for something more operationally based or something more adventurous than maybe sitting in a lab or doing research, this is the perfect career for them. And like I said, I think the career really speaks for itself, and it makes my job as a recruiter that much easier.
Well, great pitch. It does make it easier. I'm glad you pointed out that NOAA Corps officers are by law considered veterans of service and have access to the VA benefits that flow with that. But also NOAA Corps officers can be militarized by the President of the United States under statutory provisions at certain times of war. Go ahead. And then we're going to move on to, I want to transition to the missions.
Absolutely. Yeah, just to speak quickly to that, you mentioned about the Coast Guard being assimilated to the other services. And that was one of the biggest reasons why we moved our basic officer training class, BOTC, to the Coast Guard OCS program at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. Previous to 2012, it was at Kings Point Maritime. It was a great program, focused, predominantly on maritime training and that kind of stuff. We moved it in 2012 to simulate fully with the U.S. Coast Guard OCS program because those two services, the Coast Guard and ourselves, we have so much in common between missions and what we do and how we serve the nation that it was kind of a no-brainer. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to our sister service, the U.S. Coast Guard, and all that they do as far as partnerships in promoting the NOAA Corps as well.
Well, that's great. And I actually went through a basic foster training program, number 57, back in October of 1976, and we did it at Kings Point, which was the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So I'm glad to hear you give a date of 2012. It helps put it in perspective for me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I wanted you to talk a little bit about, Lieutenant, is examples of the missions. So there's a fishery component, a survey component, a research component. We've talked a little bit about the number of planes, but maybe not as much what they do. So give us some examples of the types of missions these different components of the NOAA Corps are involved in.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And let me start by describing how NOAA's kind of organized. So NOAA is our parent agency. And within NOAA, we have 6 what we call line offices. And those line offices are best thought about as sub-agencies within NOAA. And they include the National Marine Fisheries Service, the National Ocean Service, the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, the National Weather Service, the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service, and finally, the National Marine and Aviation Operations. So those 6 line offices all have different missions, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners, and yourself included, will recognize some of them. Most predominantly, National Ocean Service, the Fisheries Service, and the Weather Service. They're the ones that are probably highlighted the most in day-to-day news. So NOAA Corps officers serve throughout all those line offices throughout their careers. And all these line offices have various missions that they and objectives that they need to get done, and that they rely on the Corps to execute those missions. So, for example, I've mentioned our fleet of 15 ships. They all fall under 3 different classes. And so they could be a fisheries research ship, and they'll predominantly serve the National Marine Fisheries Service. They could be an oceanographic research ship. They'll serve National Ocean Service. They'll service Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. They'll even service NESDIS, which is the satellite, or the Weather Service. And then you've got your hydrographic survey vessels. And those are the ones that kind of take us back to our roots and our history. Those are the ones that continue to do the nautical charting, nautical mapping that we started off doing in the early 1800s. So some of the types of missions we might be doing. So as a hydrographer, for example, assigned to one of the hydrographic vessels, you could be, deployed to somewhere in Alaska, for example, say Glacier Bay or somewhere up there, and you could be spending the summer running hydrographic missions, mapping the seafloor, which will eventually turn into our nautical charts to map our nation's waterways. It's actually pretty cool. When I go to schools or universities to do a recruiting pitch, I have a photo of a Coast and Geodetic Survey ship from 1897. Mapping the same exact area of a NOAA ship in 2013. And it's like a mirror image photo, just, one's black and white and grainy and one's pretty clear. So it's really cool to see that mission still exists, 150 years later. On the oceanographic side of things, you could be doing anything from ecosystem mapping and assessment. So working with our National Marine Sanctuaries program, doing dive operations. You could be working in remote areas of the Pacific or equatorial Atlantic, deploying atmospheric and oceanographic buoys that line our equator. You could be doing ROV missions and ocean exploration. So we've got one ship that's dedicated, and it's the nation's only ocean exploration vessel. So it goes out and it maps new areas with remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. So those are kind of our catch-all vessels. They're just multifaceted ships that can do a lot of different missions. And then finally, our fisheries vessels, they work predominantly for the National Marine Fisheries Service. And what they do is they do stock assessment. So they go out and they look at primarily commercial fisheries, and they look at, they might go ahead before a commercial season starts, and they might take assessment of what the health of that commercial fisheries looks like. They'll also do a lot of marine mammal research and long-term fisheries assessments. So what I mean by that is they do projects year in and year out, the same time frame, so they can get these data sets that are very consistent and they can tell the health of that species, the health of that ecosystem, and use that to set legislation, to set policy when it comes to fisheries. So all of it kind of ties in that way. On the other side of the house, the aircraft side of things, those planes are a lot of them are multifaceted, and they'll do a whole lot of missions. So again, they'll work for various line offices in one way or another, but sometimes they might be doing aerial marine mapping. So they might be doing coastal mapping. And where this comes to light is like right after a storm goes through or a natural emergency. We'll deploy our aircraft to kind of do some coastal mapping, aerial coastal mapping, to get an idea of the extent of damage, or how we can get first responders in. They might be doing marine mammal assessments. So just like our ships are, on the ocean and kind of doing marine mammal assessments from above, we're using our aircraft to spot pods of whales and endangered species. So that way our scientists can kind of get to them. We might be doing snow surveys in the Midwest in the winter. And what that does is we can use technology to kind of predict how much snowmelt we'll have in the spring, and that'll directly influence basically the return on investment for our farmers in the Midwest, because that, as that snowmelt comes down, that'll directly impact their seasons basically. And so you can kind of see why we're tied in the Department of Commerce in that sense, because a lot of our missions ultimately will lead to legislation or lead to funding that'll directly impact our nation's economy.
Our interview with NOAA Lieutenant Picard went on for another, 20 minutes. You can pick it up on our podcast. We encourage you to visit veteranradio.net, look at our podcasts, go to our Facebook page. We've always got something interesting. We want to thank our VSO sponsors and nvbdc.org for its continued support of our operations, as well as the Eisenhower Center. Dale will be back next week with a great program. You can always find us or reach out to us on Facebook, or email us at jim@veteransradio.net or dale@veteransradio.net. We're always looking for your ideas in terms of programs. So we'll have more for you coming into next year as we move into 2022. Hard to even say that. But until next time on Veterans Radio, you are dismissed.
With Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to... Has anyone seen the bride and groom?
Sorry, we're here. We were getting lucky in the limo and we lost track of time.
No, Lucky Land Casino, with cash prizes that add up quicker than a guest registry.
In that case, I pronounce you lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Daily bonuses are waiting. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.